Marcus Oliveira sat in his modest study, the quiet ticking of the antique clock on the wall filling the space. The muted light of the early evening painted the room in warm tones, a stark contrast to the chilly autumn wind blowing outside. He didn't like to make a show of his wealth. If anything, he often went out of his way to blend in, to avoid the stares and expectations that came with his billions. Tonight, though, was different. He was about to attend a gala, the kind of event he typically avoided, but this time, it wasn't just any gathering. His assistant, Kelly, hovered by the door, her arms crossed as she watched him button up a plain black shirt. "You know, you could wear the suit," she said, a playful smile tugging at her lips. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "No need for all that. It's not about how I look, Kelly. I'll go as I am." Kelly gave a small sigh, leaning against the doorway. "You know the kind of people that'll be there. You show up like that, and they'll think you're one of the wait staff." "Let them," Marcus replied, slipping on a simple jacket. "I'm not there to impress anyone. And besides, if they can't see beyond the clothes, they're not worth impressing." Kelly knew better than to argue. Marcus had always been like this, humble, almost to a fault. She admired it, but it made nights like this complicated. A part of her wished he'd show off just a little. After all, how many men could casually write a check with enough zeros to change someone's life? "All right," she conceded, stepping back into the hallway. "The car's ready when you are." Marcus gave her a nod and glanced at his reflection one last time. He looked every bit the part of a man who'd worked his way up from nothing. But there was a quiet confidence in his eyes that had come from years of hard-earned success. And tonight, that was enough. The gala was at one of the most luxurious hotels in the city, a towering glass building that sparkled under the streetlights. Marcus walked up to the entrance, his stride relaxed, hands in his pockets. He wasn't in a rush, nor did he care to make an entrance. The event was filled with CEOs, politicians, and celebrities. People who reveled in the attention, unlike Marcus, who found solace in the quiet corners of life. As he approached the doors, he caught sight of the security guard standing at the entrance. A tall, burly man with a stern face, he eyed Marcus suspiciously as he approached. "Excuse me," the guard said, stepping in front of Marcus. "You lost or something?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "No, I'm here for the event." The guard, Claudio Ferreira, didn't move. His eyes scanned Marcus from head to toe, clearly unimpressed with his simple attire. "I don't think so," Claudio scoffed, crossing his arms. "This is a private event. For guests only." "I'm aware," Marcus said calmly, pulling out his invitation from his pocket. "Here's my invitation." Claudio snatched the invitation from Marcus's hand, barely glancing at it before shaking his head. "Yeah, I don't think so. You don't look like the type who belongs here. Why don't you go around back? Maybe they need help in the kitchen." The words were harsh, deliberate, but Marcus kept his composure. He had been through this before, too many times, actually. The casual racism disguised as mistakes or oversights. "I'm here for the gala," Marcus repeated, his voice still steady but firmer now. "Let me through." But Claudio only smirked, taking a step forward as if to intimidate him. "I don't care what you think. This isn't your kind of place. Move along before I call for backup." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I suggest you check the list again. I believe you'll find my name there." Claudio stared at him for a moment, clearly annoyed. "You think you're some big shot, huh?" he sneered. "I know your type. Coming in here, thinking you can just blend in with people who are way out of your league." "I don't need to blend in," Marcus said, his patience thinning. "Now, either check the list, or I'll do it myself." Claudio's hand hovered over his radio, but before he could respond, a voice broke through the tension. "Marcus." Both men turned to see Eduardo Martins, the hotel's manager, rushing over, his face pale with disbelief. "Mr. Oliveira, I didn't know you'd arrived. Is there a problem?" Claudio's expression changed in an instant, the color draining from his face. He looked from Marcus to Eduardo, then back to Marcus, realization dawning painfully slowly. "This man," Eduardo began, his voice tight with embarrassment, "is our guest of honor." Claudio's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, no words coming out. Marcus stood there, his arms crossed, letting the weight of Eduardo's words sink in. He could see the shock ripple through the security guard's body as if he were just now realizing the gravity of his mistake. I didn't, Claudio stammered, his face flushed with humiliation. Marcus let out a slow breath, his frustration giving way to a quiet resolve. You didn't check, he said softly. And worse than that, you assumed. Eduardo, clearly panicked, shot a sharp look at Claudio. Go inside, Mr. Oliveira, he urged, his voice tense. I'll deal with this. For a moment, Marcus considered walking away, leaving the guard to stew in his mistake. But something stopped him. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been judged the way he just had, based on nothing but appearance. I'm staying, Marcus said, his eyes locked on Claudio. He needs to understand why what he did was wrong. The tension between the three men was palpable. Claudio's hands fidgeted nervously by his sides, his earlier bravado crumbling. He had thought he could get away with it, just another face in the crowd to push around. But now, standing before one of the most powerful men in the country, he was faced with the consequences of his arrogance. I'm sorry, Claudio muttered, his eyes downcast. Marcus took a step closer, his voice calm but commanding. It's not me you should apologize to. It's every person you've treated like this. Every person you've decided didn't belong here based on nothing but their skin color or their clothes. Claudio swallowed hard, his hands still trembling. I didn't mean. You meant exactly what you said, Marcus interrupted, his gaze steady. And that's the problem. Eduardo stepped forward, wringing his hands. Mr. Oliveira, I'll make sure this never happens again. Marcus nodded, finally breaking eye contact with Claudio. See that it doesn't. As Marcus turned to walk inside, the murmurs from the guests who had witnessed the scene followed him like a shadow. He could feel the weight of their stares, but he didn't care. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about something much bigger. As he entered the grand ballroom, the lavish decorations and opulent chandeliers glimmering above, Marcus couldn't help but feel a bittersweet taste in his mouth. He had worked his whole life to be in these rooms, but no amount of success would ever shield him from the reality of who people assumed he was. And tonight, that truth had been laid bare for all to see. The echoes of Marcus's speech still lingered in the air, leaving the ballroom in a hushed awe. But outside, at the entrance of the hotel, the tension between Claudio and Eduardo thickened. Marcus had retreated to a quiet corner after his speech, but the incident at the door continued to ripple through the night. Claudio stood by the entrance, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. He hadn't imagined things would turn out this way. A cold sweat clung to his back as he replayed the moment in his mind. The way he had dismissed Marcus, the condescending remarks, the realization that Marcus Oliveira, the man he had humiliated, was not just a wealthy guest, but a figure of immense influence and power, gnawed at him. Eduardo marched toward Claudio, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and fury. Do you have any idea what you've done? Eduardo's voice was low, but the anger was palpable. Claudio tried to compose himself, swallowing hard. I didn't know. He didn't look like. Like what? Eduardo cut him off, his voice rising. Like someone who belongs here? You didn't check, Claudio? And now we're the hotel that humiliated one of the most important men in this city. Claudio's face turned crimson. He tried to find the words, but none of them felt right. I'm sorry, Eduardo. It was a mistake. I didn't mean to. A mistake? Eduardo's tone was incredulous. Do you realize that Marcus could have this hotel shut down with a single phone call? And you stood there, judging him like he was beneath you. Claudio lowered his eyes, shame burning through him. I thought he was just some guy trying to get in. He wasn't dressed for the event. Eduardo let out a frustrated sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. You think a man like Marcus Oliveira cares about that? He's beyond appearances. He came here for the event, not to show off his wealth. And instead of welcoming him, you insulted him. Claudio shifted uncomfortably. What do you want me to do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eduardo fixed him with a hard stare. For starters, you're going to apologize. Not that it will change much, but it's the least you can do. Claudio's stomach churned at the thought. Apologizing to Marcus after what he'd done. It felt like an impossible task. But before he could protest, Eduardo gave him a sharp nod toward the ballroom. Now, Claudio, before I decide whether you have a job tomorrow. Inside the ballroom, Marcus stood by a large window, his back to the bustling crowd. He watched the city skyline, his thoughts far away. The gala was still in full swing, people mingling and congratulating each other on their successes. But for Marcus, the night had taken on a different meaning. He couldn't shake the feeling of the interaction with Claudio, the guard who had judged him so quickly. Marcus. He turned to see Kelly approaching, her eyes full of concern. You okay? Marcus offered her a small, tired smile. I'm fine, Kelly. Just thinking. Kelly glanced around the room. You made quite the speech. People are still talking about it. Marcus sighed. It's easy to talk about change. Making it happen is another thing. Kelly stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. You've done more than talk, Marcus. You've made people listen. That matters. Before Marcus could respond, the sight of Claudio approaching from the corner of his eye caught his attention. The security guard was moving toward them slowly, his head down, shoulders hunched. Marcus's face remained impassive as Claudio stopped a few feet away. Claudio cleared his throat awkwardly, his eyes darting between Marcus and Kelly before settling on the floor. Mr. Oliveira, I need to apologize. Kelly crossed her arms, eyeing Claudio with suspicion. Marcus, however, remained calm, his expression unreadable. Claudio continued, his voice shaky. I didn't know who you were. I made assumptions, and I treated you unfairly. I'm sorry. I was wrong. For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Claudio shifted nervously, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. Finally, Marcus spoke, his tone even but firm. It's not about who I am, Claudio. It's about who you thought I wasn't. Claudio's face twisted in shame. I know. I shouldn't have judged you. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to? Marcus repeated, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then why did you? Claudio opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had no answer, not one that would make sense. He had judged Marcus based on nothing more than his appearance, and he knew it. Marcus shook his head, a hint of disappointment in his eyes. People like you have been doing this my whole life. Assuming, judging, deciding where I do and don't belong. You didn't care who I was. All you saw was someone who didn't fit into your idea of who should be here. Claudio flinched at the truth of Marcus's words. He had no defense, no justification. He had been wrong, and now he had to face the consequences. I'm truly sorry, Claudio muttered again, his voice barely audible. Marcus studied him for a moment longer, then finally nodded. Apology accepted. But remember this. The next time you're quick to judge someone, ask yourself why. It's not about me. It's about the assumptions you carry with you. Claudio nodded, feeling the weight of his mistake settle even more heavily on his shoulders. Thank you, he mumbled before turning to leave, his head hanging low. Kelly watched him go, her expression softening slightly. Think he learned his lesson? Marcus shrugged, his gaze returning to the window. We'll see. As the night wore on, Marcus found himself drifting from conversation to conversation, his mind still on Claudio and the events at the entrance. The gala was meant to be a celebration of his work, his success. Yet the moment he walked through the door, he had been reduced to a stranger, a man who didn't belong in his own space. David Hartford, the same CEO from earlier, approached him again, a glass of champagne in hand. Marcus, my man. That speech, it was something else. Marcus forced a polite smile. Thanks, David. David, oblivious to the tension still swirling in Marcus's mind, grinned. You know, it's good to remind people about where we come from. Makes them appreciate what we've built. Marcus looked at him, his smile fading slightly. It's not just about where we come from. It's about where we are now, and who still gets left out. David blinked, his smile faltering. What do you mean? Marcus took a sip of his drink, his eyes scanning the room. There are people in this room who will never face what I did tonight. They'll never be judged for the color of their skin, the way they dress, or where they come from. And yet, they think they understand what success means. David's brows furrowed in confusion. But Marcus, you've made it. You're here. You're one of the most successful men in this room. Marcus shook his head slightly, his voice quiet but firm. Success isn't just about making it. It's about breaking down the barriers that keep others from making it too. David frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Well, I'm sure things will change eventually. Marcus gave him a long, steady look. They won't change on their own, David. It takes more than speeches. It takes action. David shifted awkwardly, not sure how to respond. Right, well, I guess that's something to think about. Marcus nodded, his thoughts elsewhere. Yeah, something to think about. As the night came to a close, Marcus stepped outside the hotel, breathing in the cool night air. The city skyline stretched out before him, glittering with lights. Kelly joined him, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill. You did good tonight, Marcus, she said softly. You always do. Marcus smiled faintly. It's not enough, Kelly. Not yet. Kelly looked at him, her expression full of understanding. It's never been enough for you, has it? Marcus shook his head. No, and it never will be until things change. For a moment, they stood in silence, watching the city hum with life. Marcus knew that tonight had been just one step in a much larger journey. A journey not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been judged, dismissed, or underestimated. There was still so much work to be done. The night had deepened, but the tension that clung to the air around the hotel was still palpable. Despite Marcus's speech and the apparent closure of the incident, it was clear that things had not fully settled. Claudio lingered at the back of the room, a heavy cloud of shame still hanging over him. He watched as the crowd mingled, laughing and exchanging compliments about Marcus's address, but there was an unease in the way his colleagues occasionally glanced in his direction. Whispers followed him, but no one dared approach. Eduardo, on the other hand, stood by the entrance, his brow furrowed in thought. The weight of the night's events rested on his shoulders, and the image of Marcus's calm disappointment replayed in his mind. He hadn't been able to shake it since. As hotel manager, Eduardo had dealt with countless crises, but this felt different, deeper. He could feel the shift happening, the way the hotel would now be viewed in the eyes of its elite clientele. Something had to be done. But what? He turned his gaze to Claudio, knowing that whatever his decision, it would come down to this man and his actions. Meanwhile, Marcus had quietly stepped out of the grand ballroom, escaping the endless stream of congratulations. The praise felt hollow after the night's confrontation. As he stood on the balcony overlooking the glittering skyline, Kelly joined him, her presence grounding in the silent night air. You don't seem like a man who just made the speech of the decade, Kelly said, her voice soft. Marcus chuckled, but there was no humor in it. I don't feel like one. She looked at him closely, noting the way his eyes seemed distant, even with the bustling city just beyond the railing. You did the right thing tonight, Marcus. You always do. Marcus sighed, leaning against the cool metal of the railing. The right thing, maybe. But it doesn't feel like enough, Kelly. I walked into that building, and before I even opened my mouth, I was judged. And sure, Claudio apologized, but you and I both know that's not where this ends. Kelly crossed her arms, the weight of his words settling in. No, it's not. But you made them see. You made everyone see. But for how long? Marcus replied, turning to face her. People like Claudio, they don't change overnight. They don't just wake up and stop judging others. It runs deeper than that. Then what are you saying? Kelly asked, her voice full of concern. That none of this matters? No, Marcus said firmly. It matters. But we have to push harder. If we don't, this kind of thing will keep happening. Not just to me, but to anyone who walks into a place like this and doesn't fit in. Kelly nodded, understanding. So, what's the plan, Marcus? Because I know you're already thinking 5 steps ahead. Marcus was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the city below. We don't let this go. I'm going to use this, Kelly. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's ever had to prove they belong in a world that tries to shut them out. Before Kelly could respond, the door to the balcony creaked open, and Eduardo stepped out, his expression a mixture of nerves and determination. "Mr. Oliveira," Eduardo began, his voice hesitant but steady. "May I have a word?" Marcus nodded, gesturing for him to join them. "Of course, Eduardo." Eduardo hesitated, glancing between Marcus and Kelly before speaking. "First, I want to apologize again for what happened earlier. Claudio's actions were inexcusable, and I take full responsibility as the manager of this establishment." Marcus studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate your apology, Eduardo, but you should know, this isn't just about tonight." Eduardo's brow furrowed, confusion clouding his face. "I don't follow." Marcus crossed his arms, his voice steady but firm. "What happened tonight is a reflection of something bigger. It's not just about one man's mistake. It's about the assumptions people carry, the ones they don't even realize they have. Claudio isn't the only one guilty of this, Eduardo, and it won't end with him." Eduardo's face paled slightly as Marcus's words sank in. "I understand. But what can we do? What can I do to make this right?" Marcus exchanged a glance with Kelly before answering. "You can start by holding your people accountable. Not just Claudio, but everyone who works here. You need to make it clear that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated, ever." Eduardo nodded, the weight of Marcus's words heavy on his conscience. "You're right. We need to make changes. And I'll start by addressing this with the staff immediately. I'll make sure everyone knows that this kind of treatment is unacceptable." "That's a start," Marcus said, "but it won't be enough." Eduardo frowned, unsure of what Marcus was getting at. "What else do you suggest?" Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing with possibilities. "I want to see this hotel lead by example. Implement training programs for your staff, diversity training, bias awareness, the works. Make it part of your culture here. Don't just punish the ones who make mistakes. Teach them before they even get the chance to." Eduardo's eyes widened slightly. "You want us to change the way we train our staff?" "I want you to change the way you think about your staff," Marcus corrected. "And your guests. You've got a chance here to turn this into something bigger than just a one-time incident. Don't waste it." Eduardo stood silently for a moment, absorbing Marcus's words. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I'll do it. Whatever it takes, I'll make sure it happens." Marcus gave him a small, approving nod. "Good. That's all I ask." As Eduardo turned to leave, clearly rattled but determined, Kelly looked at Marcus with a knowing smile. "You always know how to make things happen." Marcus smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I just hope this time it sticks." Inside, the gala had begun winding down, but the buzz from Marcus's speech and the earlier incident still hung in the air. Claudio, now standing near the exit, kept his eyes low, avoiding the stares of the remaining guests. He hadn't expected things to turn out this way. In his mind, the night had started as just another shift, and now he was at risk of losing everything. A soft voice broke through his thoughts. "Claudio." He turned to see Marcus standing a few feet away, his expression calm but serious. Claudio swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "Mr. Oliveira?" Marcus studied him for a moment, then took a step closer. "I wanted to speak with you." Claudio's stomach tightened with dread. "Look, Just listen," Marcus interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "What happened tonight can't be undone. You know that. But what you do next, that's still up to you." Claudio's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Marcus crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "You've got a choice here. You can walk away from this, carry the shame, and let it define you. Or you can take responsibility, learn from it, and make sure it never happens again." Claudio stared at him, speechless. He hadn't expected this. He had expected anger, dismissal, anything but this. "I'm giving you a second chance, Claudio," Marcus said, "but only if you're willing to change. Truly change." Claudio's throat tightened, emotion welling up in his chest. I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Marcus replied. "Just think about it. And the next time you see someone who doesn't fit your idea of who belongs, remember tonight." Claudio nodded slowly, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. "I will. I promise." With that, Marcus gave him a final nod before turning and walking away, leaving Claudio standing there, his mind racing with the possibility of redemption. As the hotel began to empty and the last of the guests trickled out, Marcus and Kelly made their way to the entrance. The night had been long, exhausting in more ways than one, but Marcus felt a sense of resolve settling in. "You did more than just make a speech tonight," Kelly said as they stepped outside. Marcus smiled softly. "Let's hope it's enough to make a difference." "It will be," Kelly said confidently, "because you won't stop until it is." Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "You know me too well." As they walked toward the car, the cool night air filling their lungs, Marcus glanced back at the hotel, a quiet determination in his eyes. The journey was far from over, but tonight had been a step in the right direction, and that was all he needed to keep moving forward. As the car pulled away from the hotel, Marcus sat in silence, watching the city lights blur past the window. The gala, the speech, Claudio's apology, all of it weighed heavily on his mind. Beside him, Kelly scrolled through her phone, checking messages and updates, but even she could feel the tension lingering in the car. "You're awfully quiet," she said, glancing up from her screen. Marcus let out a long breath, leaning back in his seat. "It's just everything tonight. It doesn't sit right with me." Kelly raised an eyebrow. "You handled it perfectly, Marcus. Everyone at that event will be talking about your speech for weeks. And Claudio, he's been dealt with." "That's just it," Marcus said, his voice low. Claudio's apology was just the beginning. How many more Claudios are out there? People who make assumptions about others without a second thought? What happened tonight is just one example of what happens every day to so many people. Kelly paused, considering his words. "You're right. But what you did tonight, it's a start. A big one." Marcus nodded, but said nothing. The car continued through the streets, the quiet hum of the engine filling the space between them. He knew Kelly was right, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be done, more to address. Suddenly, Marcus's phone vibrated on the seat beside him. He picked it up, frowning as he saw an unknown number on the screen. "Who is it?" Kelly asked, noticing the look on his face. "I don't know," Marcus replied, hesitating for a moment before answering. "Hello? Mr. Oliveira?" A familiar voice came through the line. "It's Eduardo Martins." Marcus sat up a little straighter, surprised. "Eduardo? What's going on?" There was a pause on the other end before Eduardo spoke again, his tone urgent. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, and I wanted to let you know we're starting to take steps, immediately. I've spoken with the staff, and I've made it clear that changes are coming. But there's something else I need to tell you." Marcus exchanged a quick glance with Kelly, his curiosity piqued. "Go on." "It's about Claudio," Eduardo continued. "After you left, he stayed behind. I thought he was going to apologize to more guests, but, well, it turns out he didn't. He was caught arguing with another staff member, one of our janitors. Apparently, he made more inappropriate comments." Marcus's jaw tightened. "What kind of comments?" "More of the same," Eduardo sighed. "Racist. Disparaging. I had no choice but to suspend him, Mr. Oliveira, but I thought you should know." A heavy silence followed as Marcus absorbed the information. He'd thought Claudio had learned his lesson, but clearly, the problem ran deeper than he'd realized. "Thank you for letting me know," Marcus finally said, his voice calm but firm. "You did the right thing." "Of course," Eduardo replied. "We'll be following up with more training for the staff, like you suggested. This won't happen again." "I hope not," Marcus said, his tone carrying the weight of his disappointment. "Because if it does, the consequences will be much more severe." They exchanged a few more pleasantries before hanging up. Marcus placed his phone back in his lap, staring out the window, his thoughts racing. "Trouble?" Kelly asked, sensing the shift in his mood. Marcus let out a frustrated sigh. "Claudio hasn't learned anything. He's still the same man he was when he insulted me. He was caught making racist comments to another employee." Kelly's eyes widened. "What? After everything that happened tonight?" "Exactly," Marcus muttered, shaking his head. "It's like nothing sunk in. And now, Eduardo had to suspend him." "Well, he had it coming," Kelly said firmly. "You gave him a chance, Marcus." You even told him to learn from it. If he didn't, that's on him. I know, Marcus replied, his voice laced with frustration. But it's not just about Claudio. It's about everyone who thinks like him, who acts like him. Kelly nodded, her expression thoughtful. So, what's next? You can't let this eat at you forever. Marcus was silent for a long moment, his mind working through the possibilities. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady with determination. I need to make a bigger impact. Tonight was just the beginning. We need to take this fight further. The following morning, Marcus woke up early, his mind still buzzing from the night before. He couldn't shake the lingering frustration with Claudio, and as he sipped his coffee, he began outlining a plan in his mind. This wasn't just about the hotel anymore. It was about a broader system, a way of thinking that needed to be challenged at its core. Morning, Kelly's voice called from the kitchen as she appeared, holding her own cup of coffee. You're up early. Couldn't sleep, Marcus replied, setting his cup down on the table. I've been thinking about everything that happened. Kelly sat down across from him, her gaze curious. And we're going to start something, Marcus said, his tone serious. We're going to launch a campaign. Nationwide. Kelly's eyebrows shot up. A campaign? Marcus nodded. I want to take what happened last night and use it as a catalyst for change. We'll create a national initiative, something that tackles these issues head-on. Training programs, public awareness campaigns, education in workplaces. It's time to confront this problem directly. Kelly leaned back in her chair, absorbing the weight of his words. You're not thinking small, are you? When have I ever? Marcus replied with a wry smile. She chuckled, shaking her head. True. But this is going to be huge. You're talking about a movement. That's exactly what I'm talking about, Marcus said, his eyes bright with determination. We need to do more than just address individual incidents. We need to change the culture. And it starts now. Kelly's expression shifted to one of admiration, mixed with a hint of concern. You know this won't be easy, right? There's going to be pushback. A lot of it. I know, Marcus said firmly, but that doesn't mean we don't try. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, let's do it. Over the next few weeks, Marcus threw himself into the campaign, working tirelessly to bring his vision to life. Meetings with corporate leaders, media interviews, partnerships with civil rights organizations, every day was packed with activity. The message was clear. It was time to confront the biases and assumptions that had been allowed to fester for too long. As the campaign gained momentum, Marcus found himself invited to speak at more events, share his experiences, and advocate for change. His face became synonymous with the movement, and slowly but surely, people began to take notice. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Marcus sat in his office, reviewing the latest plans for the next phase of the campaign. Kelly knocked on the door before entering, holding a stack of reports. You've been in here for hours, she said, her tone light but concerned. You should take a break. Marcus rubbed his eyes, leaning back in his chair. I will. Just need to finish going over these proposals. Kelly set the reports down on his desk, then crossed her arms, watching him closely. You know, I've been thinking. Oh, Marcus teased. What now? I've been thinking about Claudio, she said, her tone serious. What if you reached out to him again? Marcus frowned, surprised by the suggestion. Why would I do that? Kelly shrugged, sitting down across from him. Because maybe he's had time to reflect. You gave him one chance. Maybe he deserves another. Marcus hesitated, his mind racing back to the incident at the hotel. I don't know, Kelly. He didn't exactly show any signs of changing. I know, she said softly. But people can change, Marcus. Sometimes they just need time. Marcus was quiet, mulling over her words. It wasn't that he didn't believe in second chances. He'd built his career on giving people the opportunity to prove themselves. But Claudio had seemed so deeply rooted in his ways, so resistant to learning. Think about it, Kelly continued. If you reach out to him now, after everything, it could send a message that this movement isn't just about punishment. It's about growth, transformation. Marcus studied her for a moment, then sighed. I'll think about it. Kelly smiled. That's all I ask. Days later, Marcus found himself back at the hotel, this time for a follow-up meeting with Eduardo. The lobby was quieter than before, the buzz of the gala long gone. As Marcus waited for Eduardo to arrive, he couldn't help but think about Kelly's words. Maybe she was right. Maybe reaching out to Claudio would offer a different kind of closure, not just for him, but for the movement. As if on cue, Eduardo appeared, smiling warmly as he approached. "Marcus, good to see you again." "Likewise," Marcus replied, shaking his hand. "How's everything going here?" "Much better," Eduardo said with a nod. The sun had barely risen when Marcus received the message that Claudio had accepted the meeting. It wasn't the type of closure Marcus expected, but after everything that had happened, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle that needed to be addressed. He wasn't quite sure what to expect from Claudio, but deep down, Marcus knew this was an opportunity, not just for Claudio, but for the movement he'd started. "Are you sure about this?" Kelly asked as Marcus prepared for the meeting. She stood by his office door, arms crossed, her expression filled with both curiosity and concern. Marcus looked up from his desk, his face calm but thoughtful. "I'm sure," he said quietly. "This has to happen. If we're talking about real change, it can't just be about punishment. It has to be about giving people a chance to grow." Kelly nodded slowly. "You're right. But Claudio, do you really think he's capable of changing?" Marcus paused for a moment, considering the question. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I have to believe he is. Otherwise, what's the point of everything we're doing?" Kelly smiled, though her eyes remained serious. "You're a good man, Marcus. Most people wouldn't even consider giving someone like Claudio a second chance." Marcus chuckled softly. "It's not about being a good man. It's about understanding where people are coming from and showing them there's a different way." A few hours later, Marcus arrived at a small cafe in the city, a neutral meeting spot suggested by Claudio himself. The location was humble, almost anonymous, far removed from the luxurious world of hotels and galas where their paths had first crossed. It was the kind of place where no one would recognize them, and that was exactly what Marcus wanted. As he stepped inside, he spotted Claudio sitting at a corner table, his posture tense, eyes downcast. He was dressed in casual clothes, far from the stern, uniformed figure who had once stood at the entrance of the gala, judging Marcus based on nothing but appearance. Marcus approached the table quietly, his footsteps light, but Claudio looked up the moment Marcus drew near. Their eyes met, and for a brief second, there was a flash of uncertainty in Claudio's gaze. "Mr. Oliveira," Claudio greeted, standing up awkwardly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Marcus nodded and gestured for him to sit back down. "Claudio, let's just talk." They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Claudio broke the silence, his voice strained. "I know there's nothing I can say that'll make up for what I did that night," Claudio began, his eyes focused on the table. "And after everything, I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want you to know that I've been thinking about it, constantly. What I did was wrong, and I'm ashamed of the way I treated you." Marcus listened, his face unreadable. He didn't interrupt, allowing Claudio to speak at his own pace. "I grew up in a place where people like you, people of color, were always treated differently," Claudio continued, his voice faltering slightly. "It's not an excuse, but it shaped how I saw the world. When you showed up that night, I didn't see a successful man. I didn't see a guest. I just saw someone who didn't belong, and I acted on that assumption." Marcus remained silent, his eyes fixed on Claudio, waiting for him to finish. "I lost my job because of it," Claudio said, his voice soft but sincere. "And honestly, I deserved to. But losing my job made me realize that I've spent my whole life making the wrong choices, believing the wrong things. And now, I'm trying to change that." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "What does change look like to you, Claudio?" Claudio hesitated, his eyes searching Marcus's face for understanding. "It means learning to see people differently. It means not making assumptions about who they are or where they come from. It means accepting that the world is bigger than the narrow view I grew up with." There was a long pause as Marcus processed Claudio's words. For the first time since their initial confrontation, He saw something in Claudio that he hadn't seen before: humility. It wasn't just guilt or regret. It was a genuine desire to learn and grow. "I'm glad you've come to that realization," Marcus said slowly. "But you have to understand that change doesn't happen overnight. It's not enough to just say the words. You have to live them. Every day." Claudio nodded, his face serious. "I know, and I'm willing to do that. I just need the chance." Marcus studied him for a moment, weighing his words carefully. "I believe in second chances, Claudio. That's why I agreed to meet with you. But if I'm going to give you that chance, you need to prove to me, and to yourself, that you're committed to this change." Claudio looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "I am. I swear, I am." Marcus nodded, his voice steady. "Then here's what I want you to do. I'm starting a campaign, something big. It's focused on addressing systemic racism, not just in workplaces, but everywhere. If you're serious about changing, I want you to be part of it." Claudio blinked, surprised by the offer. "You want me to help? After everything I've done?" "Yes," Marcus said firmly, "because this isn't just about what you did that night. It's about what happens next. If you can show others that change is possible, even for someone like you, then maybe we can start making a real difference." Claudio's eyes welled with emotion, his voice thick as he replied, "I'll do whatever it takes, Mr. Oliveira. I won't let you down." Marcus smiled faintly, though the weight of the situation still hung between them. "Don't do it for me, Claudio. Do it for yourself." Weeks passed, and true to his word, Claudio joined Marcus's campaign. At first, the decision was met with skepticism from many within the movement. Some questioned whether Claudio deserved a second chance, while others doubted his sincerity. But Marcus remained firm in his belief that change had to come from within, and that people like Claudio, if given the opportunity, could be part of the solution. Claudio attended every meeting, participated in workshops, and even spoke publicly about his experiences, both his mistakes and his journey toward change. The more he shared, the more people began to see that transformation was possible, even for those who had once perpetuated the very biases they now sought to dismantle. One evening, after a particularly emotional event, Claudio approached Marcus backstage, his face tired but hopeful. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about living the change every day," Claudio began, his voice earnest. "It's hard, but it's worth it." Marcus smiled, his expression warm but knowing. "It's always going to be hard, but the fact that you're here, doing the work, that's what matters." Claudio nodded, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you." Marcus shook his head. "You did this for yourself, Claudio. I just gave you the chance." As they stood there, the noise of the event fading in the background, Marcus realized that this, more than any speech, any campaign, was the true heart of the movement he'd started. It wasn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It was about people like Claudio learning to see the world, and themselves, differently. Months later, Marcus's campaign had grown into a national movement, with corporations, schools, and communities across the country adopting the training programs and initiatives he'd spearheaded. The media had picked up on the story, and Marcus's name had become synonymous with change. But through it all, he remained grounded in the knowledge that real transformation was happening, not in boardrooms or press conferences, but in the everyday lives of people willing to confront their biases and assumptions. As Marcus stood on stage at a conference, preparing to deliver yet another speech, he glanced at the audience, searching for familiar faces. Claudio sat near the front, his posture relaxed, his expression one of quiet confidence. It was a stark contrast to the man he'd first encountered at the hotel months ago. When Marcus began speaking, his words were as much for Claudio as they were for the rest of the audience. "We live in a world where change is possible," Marcus said, his voice steady and strong. "But change doesn't come easily. It takes courage. It takes effort. And most importantly, it takes the willingness to look within ourselves and confront the parts of us we wish didn't exist. That's where real transformation begins." The audience erupted into applause, but Marcus's gaze remained on Claudio, who nodded in silent understanding. In that moment, Marcus knew that the movement he had started was about more than just fighting racism. It was about giving people the chance to become better versions of themselves. And that, he realized, was the true measure of success.